Welcome to the Environmental Psychology Groningen podcast. We're here to speak with the scientists who are doing research in the field of environmental psychology, which encompasses a lot of different disciplines and topics. And we're here today with a postdoc who works here in the department, who's going to tell us a little bit about his research. And that is Žan Mlakar. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Always happy to talk about my research.
Always happy to walk across the hallway
indeed.
Talk about
this
your
long
research.
Path.
Yes, I know. It took a long time. It was hard to find. But yeah, if you could explain a bit about what you've been researching within the field of environmental psychology.
Yeah, certainly. So most of my work so far throughout my PhD was on so-called social tipping. So basically less focused on the individual change that a lot of people focus in our department, more focused on the overall societal level change, population level change, where basically I try to see how that change comes about, what kind of motivations play a role in that change coming about, and so on, and like how does it look in the end in reality and so on. Then we try to capture that in the lab and just see basically how can we change the society as a whole.
Yeah, so tipping as in like tipping points.
Tipping
right?
points, indeed. Yeah, correct. Like how do we reach enough critical mass of certain change, right, such that everybody else follows like it usually happens in societies. For example, like how do we get enough people to become vegetarians or vegans such that the rest of the society follows like automatically after them, which is kind of how it always occurs in societies because people like to conform to each other, they like to do the same things, right? And then we basically just want to see how can we get that critical mass of change.
Yeah. Speaking of plant-based things, we have your plant, as all of our guests, we've asked you to bring a plant with you. You can set this lovely creature here on the table. What is the story of this plant?
Trying to get its best angle.
This is his good side.
Let's go with that one. The story of this plant is very simple. It was a baby I received from a friend of mine when I left my previous faculty to take with me, and it's still alive, and it's 3 times as big now as it was at first, despite my influences rather than because of them. So that's a win in my book.
Yeah. So what was the previous faculty that you were working in?
I was in the faculty of economics and business in the marketing department, focused on this kind of intersection of decision making and social psychology, which is quite close to what people are doing here, but then more applied to like slightly different problems than environmental problems, but it can also be applied to environmental problems. Yeah,
so how is social psychology different from environmental? Social implies something about it, but for people who aren't as familiar with the different fields of psychology.
Yeah, certainly. Well, social psychology mostly studies people in a social context, people's decisions when they are subjugated to basically all the pressures they get from the rest of the society, like from trying to conform to other people, to trying to kind of follow certain trends and so on, right? We are like these ultra social animals who just always want to be part of the group, always want to belong, always want to cooperate. Who generally want to cooperate with each other and
Notable
so on.
exceptions, but as a whole...
Indeed, as a whole. Compared to other animals, we have way more cooperative intentions and way complexer ways of cooperation, right? And all those things guide our behavior in ways in which we aren't often aware, right? So social psychology basically tries to tap into like these different motivations, these different mechanisms that kind of guide our behavior and see how do we react to those, and when do we actually follow them, when do we make different decisions and so on, right? And that can be quite overlapping with environmental psychology, right? Because a lot of this environmental change is basically us trying to change our society, trying to change our social systems. Which consist of groups of people, and so it's basically kind of more of an applied version of social psychology, I would say, in a way.
Social psychology, as the name suggests, is about the ways that psychology acts out on the societal level or more collectively.
Yeah.
But since society is made of individuals, or the social component's made of individuals, is there a big difference between how people make decisions on an individual level versus on a collective social level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that often we have this simplifying assumption, right? It's like if we can make individuals change, that is automatically just going to lead to society changing as well, right? But it's of course way more complex than that, right? Because it's not just we make one individual change, it's that individual is interacting with every other individual and vice versa, right? So there's like all these feedback loops between people that's happening over like a certain period of time, where at each period of time, you know, society has progressed to a different extent, which of course also affects people's decisions and how they interact with one another, right? And all of this, basically all of these things, like from the time dimension to people interacting with one another and influencing one another and so on, right? All of these things add more and more layers of complexity to it, and makes it, and basically, as we would call it in science, they introduce noise, right? So they make it just more and more unpredictable. Like, when is change gonna happen? It's already super unpredictable with individuals, right? But once you take that step forward to step higher to a higher level of like the societal level, then it gets even more kind of like, okay, there's just so many different factors in interplaying. And so on, right?
Like there's no consistent variable, that everything is kind of constantly influencing each other, sort of.
Yeah, indeed, yeah, and that's like a overtime dynamic process, right? So we always have to look at overtime dynamic processes if we really want to understand this higher level change, let's call it. Yeah.
So what do you mean by like overtime dynamic? Like, I have not studied psychology. I'm still learning a lot just working here. But what does that mean exactly?
So what I specifically mean by it is that there is certain like somewhat predictable way in which change happens in a society. I think it was most popularized through like Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, right? Where and through this more classic diffusion of innovation things that I think people kind of generally tend to be quite familiar with, right? Which basically just say that there is this progression in a society that's never linear, but it's always society just tries to be on some kind of stable state, so to say,
like
right?
Sort of seeking stasis,
that kind of thing, right? And it's like a stable state is, for example, all of us agreeing on the same norm or so, right? Like so it's a stable state that we all believe that we should primarily obtain our protein from animal sources, right? Like that's like some kind of like a belief, some kind of a norm that we all believe in, and that's a stable state. And then once change starts occurring, right, it's not going to be linear from one to another, but because it's gonna again try to go to a stable state, right? So either pull everybody back to the previous kind of norms or so, or towards the new one, right? Because we all want to coordinate on these things, since it makes co-living way easier if we all do the same things, right? So basically it's this kind of quick explosive transitions over time between different stable states. Of course, they're not as quick in reality as, well, I mean,
like quick in terms of like over the course of a few years or a few generations or something?
Indeed. Instead, over a few years or few decades rather than, you know, over a course of like this. But that's what we would consider quick, right? A few years or decades.
So change can take place over the course of a few decades, but is it usually external things that kind of initiate change? Because also individuals are hard to persuade to make changes. And so what is it that actually initiates individual and social change?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, right, it's actually, if we observe the world around us, it always seems super stable, right? Like the way we live our lives and stuff. And that does make sense, right? Because we are beings who tend to prefer things to stay as they are. We're used to them. It's convenient to keep things as they are and so on, right? So of course we have a strong strive, and there needs to be some quite sizable shock, so to call it, right? In order to provoke this kind of change. And what we've seen in the past is when it comes to this kind of social norms and conventions changing, this shock can come in like many different forms, right? There's this theory that I quite like that sees society as a system, and basically says that you have different levels of the system where you can intervene to try to provoke this kind of change. And the most highest level interventions would be things like, if you change a tax on something, right, then people are going to slowly just change their behavior to adapt to that, right? So if you put higher tax on meat, people are probably going to buy less meat and so on, right? Those are very surface level, simple changes that, you know, policymakers like because they're easy to implement, but their effectiveness is always, long-term effectiveness is always questionable, right? Oh yeah. And then if you go deeper and deeper, you get to the deeper levels of society which are kind of the logics underlying the social system, right? Like the beliefs we all hold about it that most of the time we aren't even aware of, right?
Right, yeah.
And those are the things that changing which can have a more long-lasting impact, but it's also really, really hard and really, really unpredictable, right? And basically you can try to provoke a shock on any, from like the most surface to the deepest level of the system, you can provoke a shock in any of those levels, right? And it can come in terms of like external things, like, I don't know, a pandemic was a big shock in the recent years, right? Where we could see a lot of sudden social changes because of this shock.
But then we went back to normal.
Well, and then we went back to normal-ish again.
Yeah, normal-ish, yeah.
Indeed, but there was like a temporary shock, right? Where we could actually observe that we had some changes and then suddenly changed back again. And that's where it's always questionable how much change research and shock will produce, right? But the most interesting from our perspective as researchers, right, the shocks are, on one hand, like activist movements, right? So basically people or like groups of people taking our destiny in their hands and trying
on behalf of
humanity, indeed, yeah, and trying to provoke some positive change, right? Or policymaker interventions, right? So things, what can policymakers change? What kind of laws and what kind of rules can they introduce in order to provoke some kinds of changes they might desire, right?
But is there a lot of, I mean, in speaking about like protesters, like Extinction Rebellion, there's also some degree of pushback or lack of acceptance, or there's sort of double standards for different kinds of protesters, that like farmer protesters, they are portrayed in the media or in sort of general conversation in a slightly more sympathetic way, and they're kind of defending what has been sort of the status quo. Yeah. And Extinction Rebellion protesters are not necessarily described in equally positive terms. So how does sort of the public instinct to sort of resist change, when does the change happen if there's resistance and pushback? Is it always just gradual, or can you just say things have changed at this point?
No, it's always easy to say in retrospect when things have changed,
of course.
Right? Hindsight is a big blessing, but once change is happening, it's massive, right? As you said, right, there is so many always different societal actors, different groups that interact and like either push for change or push back towards change and so on, right? And all of those things produce this very complicated situation where it's kind of hard to really predict when change is going to happen. So what we do in our work is we try to simplify it, right? We take this to a lab, right? And we say, okay, let's say there's only two groups, right? There's somebody trying to provoke change in the rest of society, right? And let's say there's only two options to choose between, right? Like A and B, if only, right?
If life was so simple.
If life was so simple, but that's the only way to really somewhat cleanly tap into like what actually provokes change, when does it happen, right? Because as you said, right, in reality it's always so messy that unless you look decades back, then we can maybe say like, right, about social movements of the past, we can say like, what did they actually manage to achieve through that, right? But once you're in it, it's hard to say, indeed. Yeah,
and can you compare past social movements? Because every individual movement has different dynamics and factors, but are there sorts of trends that you can identify from past sort of watershed moments that can be like a little bit of a roadmap for saying this might increase acceptance of certain changes from like the top up or from like a cultural convention?
Yeah, certainly there are certain trends you can take from there, right? Because it's that's also how this whole field of study that I'm trying to contribute to was born. Was basically looking at it was more applied to then diffusion of innovations, but it's like a similar process, right? So how do people react to some innovations? And it was starting like 1940s with looking at like how did farmers adopt some hybrid corn in Iowa, and that's where they actually figured out this S-curve changes. Like there's this famous work from Rogers and Ryan and Gross and stuff, where they actually found out that the adoption was not linear, right? It was this when the critical mass was reached, then suddenly everybody wanted to adopt it, but before that people were very resistant and so on, right?
So does it sort of come up and down, and then eventually it reaches the tipping point?
The tipping point, then it tips, right? Yeah. And indeed, that basically this whole field was born from those kinds of observations, these very qualitative observations from this basically field occurrences, let's call it, and then from there we could actually draw some kind of insights into what kind of factors might affect these things, and then we could then start studying that in the lab, right? And then make more somewhat more definite statements about what works and what doesn't based on that.
Yeah, so this field sort of originated from changing dietary behavior, sort of in a way, more of like agricultural practices.
Yeah, indeed.
But
indeed.
that is then also a fairly useful parallel with what's going on in some aspects of environmental psychology and climate change. It's so many different aspects, but what sorts of things are you looking at to see when they have tipped? Are there specific kinds of things like adoption of heat pumps or like electrical vehicles or having a more plant-based diet? Are there specific things that you're looking at or sort of tracking, or?
Not really, because we try to, like in my own research, I try to really focus on this more broader perspective of, in general, when is something going to tip or not, right? So we try to really keep it isolated from like specific examples, because every single social situation like that, right, carries a lot of weight with it, right? Like it carries a lot of associations, people have a lot of biases they have, right? So if you suddenly start talking about adoption of heat pumps, people have so many preconceptions about them, I don't know, being expensive, then being maybe ineffective or so on, right? Like there's all these kind of thoughts people have about it, right? So then trying to study that in the lab is just going to not really work. So what we try to do is isolate it from all of those confounds and create these like games that people play, where we just give them some financial incentives that try to mirror, rather than mirroring the context, the specific like choice, mirroring the motivations they would have. And then under those, we basically artificially create a condition of group having a status quo in that game and some kind of minority pushing against it, and then observe when does the group tip to it, you know, and then that kind of gives us a way to cleanly test like this kind of causal effects of different factors, right? And and for example, like to give you a more concrete example rather than just talking in these vague words, so, like one of the things we studied, for example, was we were interested in how consistent does a minority have to be in order to provoke change, like this kind of activist minority. But like, is it good if they're consistent, right? Because then they're like being really confident, like, look, this is what we believe and so on, right? Or is it better if they're a bit more kind of forgiving towards others and so on, right? And what we found is that like it was that they were more likely to provoke tipping when they were consistent, because slightly more likely, but it was driven by two separate processes. One was they were perceived as more confident, and that made more likely to provoke tipping, right? But on the other hand, they were also perceived as more uncompromising, as inflexible, and that kind of slowed down tipping, right?
So those two things can sort of contradict each other a little bit.
They kind of contradicted each other, and overall there was slightly good for them to be consistent, but not fully, right? So that kind of gives us then, you know, it was a very artificial setting, right? But we then could find these like some more general patterns that then can be applied in the field in terms of like when should like a activist, like when should activists maybe try to be more or less consistent and so on, right? And then we can take that back into the field and maybe try to see does it work in these specific situations or for these purposes and so on.
And so, it seems kind of interesting to talk that you're focusing on like activist minorities, but is that usually actual like individuals within a smaller group, or is it a movement of some kind, or a politician who's really, you know, idealistic about a specific kind of thing? Like who is seen as like an activist minority? Like what does that mean when you're talking about that? We stick to that specific term because it's so broad. Because that's basically what we have in the lab, right? We just have a group of people, and some part of that group counters the status quo, right? And tries to change it and tries to get others to adopt something different, something new, right? And in reality, as you said, that can be many different actors, right? It can be some politician trying to enact change, or like a group of politicians pushing for some change, right? Or it can be this big movement of people, like Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future, or like any of these kinds of movements, right? All of those things are examples of these kinds of minorities we study, but we keep it in the lab. We keep it more vague, right, to kind of get the more broader insights, and then we can see in the field like how does it interact with specific types of minorities, because of course a different group will be perceived differently in the society, right? And that will of course carry certain
outcomes for their effectiveness in trying to provoke change and so on, right? So it's but it can be it can be applied to any kind of group.
Yeah. And does it make a difference if the activist is kind of coming from top down or bottom up in terms of how accepting people are of the message that they're preaching?
Yes and no.
Okay. No follow-up question.
No follow-up question, right? That solves it. That resolves
Thank you.
it.
We're done.
Yeah, no worries. No, I like to help. But it does, of course, help because there's, for example, like if we talk about these minority characteristics, right? Mm-hmm. One of the most salient characteristics when it comes to groups of activist minorities is always the amount of social power they hold, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, something coming from top down, that person or those people are going to have more power, right, than these very grassroots movements, like individually, right? They have more social levers to pull. They have more access to different things and so on, right? So that definitely plays a role, right, in how effective they are, and how they are perceived, right, as well from others. Of course, people tend to take others with more social power more seriously on average, more authority, so on, indeed, yeah. But there's also other things, right? There's where it's like studies show that another very important thing is, of course, social identity, right? Yeah. Is that group part of does that activist group belong to the same social group as I do, right? Like, are these Extinction Rebellion protesters a bunch of grass-eating hippies, as a lot of right-wing people tend to call them, portray them, or are they like part of my group, right? For example, right? And that's
like whether you identify with them,
them yourself, and that of course also plays a big role in right. So it's this whether it's top down or bottom up is important, but for different reasons. Let's say.
Yeah. So like the reasons that they're effective are different because if you're coming from the bottom up, there's more sort of believability, I guess, from the people around you that they may not think that you have like a certain vested interest or something, or they feel like it's organic and it's coming from someone who looks like them or lives a similar lifestyle.
Indeed.
But if it's coming from the top down, then people think, oh, well, this person probably knows what they're talking about because they're authoritative, providing people have trust in government or that specific politician, which I imagine is another dimension.
That's just a whole other thing.
Yeah, but in any case, they're in a better position to enforce the thing that they're trying to propose.
Certainly, indeed.
But on sort of the bottom-up level, it can be sort of tough in your own social environment to actually talk about sustainability sometimes, especially if there's like family members of yours or friends of yours that don't have the same sorts of practices at home or maybe have different views. It may feel like kind of an awkward topic of conversation, but is that really what makes a difference, like having sort of uncomfortable conversations?
So I think this is a very relatable thing to all of us, I think, right? When it comes to these discussions, and they are certainly important to have, but people tend to not have them, as you said, right? And the reason why they're important to have is especially because on one hand, that's the only way we actually learn, right? Like the mitigating climate change is basically a new problem to all of us. I mean, now it's been around for a while and we're starting to figure out how things work.
So we have the words for it a little bit more commonly now.
Indeed, yeah. We have the words to talk about it and so on, but still it's a thing we have to keep learning about in order to be able to contribute to resolving the issue, right, as much as possible. And so that's one aspect, but the other aspect is also what a lot of studies show is that there's a lot of so-called pluralistic ignorance in the society, meaning that everybody thinks they care way more about the environment than everybody else. So they really underestimate the amount of support for this kind of environmental protection and so on that exists in society, right? And I think that's in those two areas, especially, is where talking about it can really help, right? Because if we talk about it, we can then actually learn that, oh, wait, others actually care more about it than I thought. Yeah. But we don't know that currently because we don't talk about it a lot, right? Because we have all these different barriers that keep us from talking about it. Yeah,
because we're worried about the social isolation that could come from it. Is that one of the sort of the underlying reasons?
That's a big reason for sure. Yeah, it's or even more like to kind of more like put it in the context of the conversation is just we don't like being judgmental of others, right? And whenever you talk about environmental problems with people, like at least that's what we saw in our studies, is people, you always kind of start immediately seeing it not as you opening a discussion, but rather as you judging them for their actions or judging, the lack of progress being done and so on, right? And people, and that's kind of one big barrier, right, to people talking about it, because they're like afraid that, oh, but if I open this up, people will think that I'm like, this judgmental a-hole, right? That I'm just doing it in order to shame them and stuff, right? Which makes it tricky to open this, right? Because how do you start this conversation without coming off as such? If people,
like you're lecturing somebody.
Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It can come up very quickly as that, right?
Yeah.
But that also then relates to other things that people have, which is like just is it gonna make a difference if I talk about it, right? Like people always have this kind of tend to have this belief of like, it doesn't really matter, like the other person is not going to change their behavior if I talk about it, right? And so on, which is true. If you talk with a friend once about something, probably you're not going to change their mind or something, but it's
over time it can normalize it, sort of.
Exactly, yeah. It's always this more over time, long-term benefits of it and so on, right? And but it's understandable that people don't do it, right? Because it's so easy just in the situation to just be completely blinded by like, oh, wait, okay, I'm going to be judgmental. It's not going to achieve anything. It doesn't really matter. Never mind. Let me not mention that, right? Especially when it comes to people that are close to us, right? Like our family and so on.
Of course.
It's really tricky. It's really tricky.
Yeah. Yeah. So then, I mean, hopefully episodes like this can be a way of sort of normalizing that conversation too. I mean, we're looking at it from the scientific standpoint, but a lot of the sort of common ground of a lot of the different aspects of environmental psychology is about individual behavior change, but that can also mean individual behavior in how you talk to other people about your behavior.
Indeed. Yeah. And also about what you talk with them, right? Like one very interesting thing that we've seen in some of our work is that that people are way more likely to talk about the sustainability things if it's talking about systemic issues. If it's about, like, oh, but why are they not passing this policy in the parliament? Why is this change not happening in the industry, right? Like, why are the companies not doing enough and so on, right? And those are, I think, very important things to be discussed, right? People just shy away from this individual discussions, right? Of like, oh, but maybe you shouldn't eat that much meat.
Yeah.
And that's tricky, but there's still some hope, that people, at least there's in some areas, people find it easier to discuss this. So maybe if we keep up discussions like this one, then we inspire them to keep doing that as well, as much as possible.
Yes, nice. And that's an extremely optimistic note to end it on, I think.
I think so too. I kind of maybe overforced the optimism here, but here we are.
We have to just keep saying it, and then other people will get optimistic.
Exactly. That's how it works.
That's it. Yeah. That's how tipping points work.
That's
right?
how tipping works. Indeed. Yeah. If there's one thing we learned today, is that we have to keep pushing, keep being optimistic.
Don't stop talking.
Don't stop talking. I mean, it's we're kind of joking, talking about it, but it's true. It's true. Yeah. Like, don't stop talking. Don't stop believing.
Cue journey. We don't have the rights for that, but that is.
Unfortunately.
Just play it in your head.
Yeah, that's what immediately started when I said it.
When we upload it on Instagram, we can look up the audio for that. Maybe that'll be the backing track, at least the instrumental bit at the beginning.
Good idea. Let's do that. Yeah, but indeed, yeah. That's the only way we'll reach tipping points, right? If we keep working towards them and believing that they can be reached, and it's going to be messy and it's going to be hard and it's going to take a long time, but maybe we'll make it there.
Yeah.
To end on optimistic notes.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for explaining what you've been looking into, and thank you for your plant here too.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
You're welcome.
My plant also enjoyed it.
Good, I can tell. All right.
The end.
The end.